Good afternoon and welcome to chapter number 17 and the fifth one on cinema, I think. And you can see I found myself a virtual background with a series of famous extracts from British films on them. I could see the little boy from Kes there, and I can see Lawrence of Arabia, but I don't recognize everybody. Okay, so this may be the last one on cinema. I'm hoping so. And what I'd like to do today is to go through some of the more important, some of the most important directors over the last 30 years or so, so let's see what we've got there. And this is a generation of film directors who were mostly trained in television. So this was something new, of course, before 1950 and really before 1960. It wasn't too easy to be trained in television because there was very little television around, although the first television was set up in Britain in 1936. It was a very small operation. It was closed down for the period of the war, and it was really from the end of the 50s that there was plenty of money in television and not before. So let's have a look at a few of these people. I'm going to begin with Stephen Frears then. Stephen Frears, who has made a series of films. I'm going to look at just a few of them. If I was to give you a list of his films, I'd be going through 15, 20 more, and that doesn't seem to be very useful. So I'll just give you some sort of an idea. English director and producer of film and television, began working in theatre and film, and also directing a whole series of television plays, for television, in particular in the series which was on the BBC, Play for Today, which was helped get him started, and then he moved on to cinema. And the first, his actually first cinema film was in 1971, but the first one that really broke through and caused a lot of people to be talking about him was My Beautiful Laundrette, which was in 1985 and starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And so this was a love story between an Englishman and the Pakistani son of an immigrant in Britain, obviously bringing up all the questions of homophobia, of racism, and so on. And of course, we're not surprised that it was made in 1985 and not 1965, because there was a need for homosexuals to be more accepted before this kind of film could really even get the finance to be set off. So what's typical about Stephen Frears here is he likes to show sometimes real life stories, but certainly projects which explore social class, and also draw a series of very recognizable characters. It's also very much it's quite positive, although it looks at oppression. It's always quite positive. There's some very valuable human characters. So I mentioned these last week from the 1990s, The Snapper, the story of a young woman who is expecting a baby and refuses to tell her parents who the father is, and how that goes down, and which is of course very difficult, well, for the woman, but also for her parents in a quite close-knit community where all the neighbors would like to know who the father is and what's going on, a very gossip sort of run community. So it explores all these questions of social pressure. And then East is East, which explored one of his less good films, I thought, but which explored, what's the word? Which explored, what did it explore? Explored a mixed relationship between a white woman and a Pakistani man. So to keep going just a little bit with Stephen Frears, he was known a little later on, this is in 2000, 2002, for this couple of films here. And the first one, High Fidelity, is a story about obsession, really, and it's about a man who only thinks about music in a very obsessive way, as many people do. And this was something new in a way, because it's a very everyday, people who are obsessed with music or obsessed with football. The novel that this was based on was written by Nick Hornby, who wrote a series of novels about people being obsessed with football, obsessed with records, etc., etc. Very generous novels. They're not at all about mocking the person who's obsessed, but about exploring. It's also pretty funny, and that was in 2000 and a little later, 2002, Dirty Pretty Things. So here we have, again, in both of these cases, we're talking about ordinary people, rather working class people in general, and their experience in life. Now he moves on to other subjects, and I will wonder about why, because he famously in 2006 produced this film, The Queen. Now, normally when film directors, which is often British film directors, make films about queens, they make films about dead queens, because if dead queens, you can make up stories about them. You can make them more romantic, more beautiful than they really were. So this is actually quite an original, although one might think, oh, well, another royal film. It was actually quite an original attempt to portray perhaps a realistic story. It's based on true events, but perhaps a realistic way of looking at what it was like to be the Queen and the Prime Minister in this public relations disaster, which came out of Princess Diana being killed in Paris in a car driving too fast. And then what happened afterwards. A very original idea, really, to examine the Queen not as a grand story, but as a little rather grubby public relations story. How can I defend the image of the Queen when everybody loved Princess Diana, but I didn't like her very much? So quite an interesting film, I thought. Much more recently, this film here, Victoria and Abdullah, which again is based on real events. It's about Queen Victoria, so it's a 19th century film, and it's about the relationship between Queen Victoria and her young servant from India, Abdul Karim. So obviously taking a position and saying, well, let's have a look at our traditional our traditional British royals' life. Well, in fact, it wasn't all whites. Let's have a look what happened here. So although both of these films are a rather original approach to the royal film, nevertheless, they are royal films, and that made it easier for them to get money. That although Stephen Frears has very powerful stories to tell, he may also, one might also consider that he's being pushed into doing traditional British pictures with traditional British royal furniture and royal costumes and so on and so forth, that he's being pushed into something which ends up being a heritage film. And as I mentioned last week, many people think has a conservative message, whatever the film, whatever the story is, in some way it makes royalty attractive, and that can be seen as a conservative message. Let's move on to another, and possibly the best known of these directors, Ken Loach, born in 1936. Now, Ken Loach also goes for social stories, even political stories. He's much more political than Stephen Frears. A very left-wing gentleman is Ken Loach. He's also known for, now he began on television as well, and he produced a series of films like The Price of Coal in 1977 for television, which was the life of coal miners and what happened the day when the Prince of Wales was going to come and visit the mine. So this was a realistic portrayal of miners' lives, but also very funny. He went on to produce a whole series of films, some of which made very little money. Looks and Smiles in 1981, a depressing story of being unemployed and joining the army because there are no jobs and being terribly bored in the army. In 1990, he wrote Hidden Agenda about Northern Ireland and the occupation by British troops. In 1991, Riff Raff about casual building workers. So really some very sharp social films, but not very very gay and merry and happy. And he moved on to things which were more contrasting in the 90s. So 1993, Raining Stones. and 1996 Carter's Songs are two good examples where there's still very much a hard story about poverty, oppression, and exploitation, but there is always, in the later films from now on, there always seems to be some sort of element of hope. There's something that they manage to do at the end, which is not they all live happily ever after, because this wouldn't be believable for poor working class people in late capitalism. It's more that something goes right. They get their own back a little bit. They get a little bit of respite or something. Now, Raining Stones is an extremely moving picture, especially for Catholics like myself from the north of England, because it's about Catholics in the north of England, and you can see that this little girl is wearing a white dress that is for her first communion, and the whole story is how she is so excited because it's her first communion, and she wants to look pretty with a white dress like everybody else, and her parents don't have the money to buy the dress, and it's what happens there, Raining Stones. Carter's Song is in some ways a more generally political film, not just a social film, but a political film. It's about a bus driver who falls in love with a refugee from Nicaragua, and goes back to Nicaragua with her and discovers the civil war there, which is where the right wing are supported by the United States of America, and sees some horrible things, yes. And doesn't really know how to react. So here we have both a pretty hard war film in parts, and a social realist, what's it like being a bus driver in Glasgow film, but also a very beautiful love story. So you get a bit of everything together there. The other thing I wanted to mention about Ken Loach is he does have a particular way of working with actors, and that is that he doesn't tell the actors what is going to happen in the story. He allows them to improvise somewhat. So there's one of his films, and I don't remember which one, where the debt collector comes round to threaten a working class woman who cannot pay the money she owes, and tell her, if you don't have the money by next week, it will be, terrible things will happen to you or your children. And he pushes her against the wall, and then the debt collector says, take off your wedding ring. I have one. Take off your wedding ring and give it to me. So this is very, very violent. The wedding ring is extremely important to her. But in fact, the actress had not been told that it was really the actress's wedding ring. And so Ken Loach doesn't tell the actors what's going to happen. And that can make the what in his theory, this makes the actors act better because they're discovering real feelings. There's another example where there's a gunfight, and he doesn't tell the actors which one is going to be killed. I could go on forever about Ken Loach, but I won't. Here we have two more films which are political history. And here the aim is, now of course each person can decide whether they think it's successful or not, but the aim is both to tell a story about characters we care about, and also to explain political history from a left-wing point of view. So Land and Freedom is actually about the Spanish Civil War, where General Franco, I'm not sure he was a general at the time, but anyway, Francisco Franco revolted against the democratic elected republic and gathered an army together and attacked the republic. And for 3 years, they were fighting and the fascists won. That's the short story. And a whole load of British workers, especially miners and often members of the Communist Party, went over, indeed with French people and American people, to fight for the Republic against the fascists. And this is the story of one of them and what happened. The story includes a lot of political explanation about the role of the Communist Party, which was pretty unglorious, and the need for, well, it gives suggestions about how it would have been possible to win against the fascists. So that's all very political, yeah. But instead of a documentary, he's got this rather exciting love story again, love story. So here you have them together, political history and the love story. Now, of course, there are many ways to look at this. You could think that, oh well, the love story gets people into the cinemas and makes them feel good, and that way they will learn the political history. Or you might think, well, really, they're looking at the political history, but really it's just all about love story and feeling good. So it's not really good political history. Many different opinions are available here. The other one, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, is about the situation in Ireland just after the First World War, and when Ireland was divided into Northern Ireland and what was then the Irish Free State, Southern Ireland, as a solution, in inverted commas, to the conflict between Protestants, often originally colonists from colonist ancestry, and Catholics from the native Irish. So now I think it's fair to say that it was not a very good solution, because 100 years later the problems continue. But this is a very hard story to watch, this one, about the personal relations. So there's very much the family story in there as well. So it's really very far distant from any kind of documentary, but there is political history and personal stories. Just two more, then these are the most recent ones. Not the most recent ones, these are more recent ones. 2011 is a film, Root Irish, about young working class men joining the working in Iraq as private security. But private security was really mercenaries. Yeah, that they were ex-soldiers, and they were working in Iraq, and it's full of scandalous things which soldiers did in Iraq. Again, not a great fun film, but putting together how people's real lives, ordinary people's real lives, are smashed up and taken apart and sometimes partly put back together in a situation of war. And the other one, really rather a surprising one, Looking for Eric, which is a little bit of a fantasy film where a working class man with great social and other problems, a whole load of problems to deal with, a terrible situation, likes to imagine he's talking to Eric Cantona, his football hero. And in the film, so as a bit of a fantasy film, Eric then turns up and helps to solve the problem temporarily. Now, what's fascinating about this film is actually Eric Cantona who had the idea and came to see Ken Loach and said, can we make this film? And so Ken Loach always says, it depends, spend a couple of weeks with my scriptwriter and see if you've got a good idea. But eventually it did come together, and there can't be that many films which were suggested by footballers. Let's move on to Mike Leigh, who was born in 1943. So you can see that none of the ones which are very well known are very young these days. That seems tremendously old to me, even to me. And this is this generation which was trained on the television. I have a couple of younger ones later. So Mike Leigh. And Mike Leigh then again looking for very human stories, but with a political taint sometimes, although not as much as Ken Loach. First of all, then Secrets and Lies, which is a fascinating human story where the young black woman who's been brought up by middle-class adoptive parents takes advantage of the new law. There was a new law in Britain at the time that gave people the right to find out who their original parents were. And so she finds out who her original parents were through the agency and decides to contact them. But she sees on the paper that it says that her mother is white. And she says, well, how can my mother be white? And in fact, her mother was white. And she contacts her mother, who's a poor working class woman, not in great shape. And it's about how they try to put their relationship back together, and that the mother had never told anybody that she had a daughter that she had very young, that she'd given up for adoption. The other one, more political, Vera Drake, is a historical film, not about great men, but about an ordinary woman who, I think it's in the 1950s, organized illegal abortions for the people in her town. Abortion was illegal until 1967, and one of the main reasons they made it legal was because of the very large number of women who died every year with illegal abortions by untrained staff. And so this is the story of how she was just an ordinary, friendly, positive woman in a working class street. And then one day, to the great surprise of all her family and all her neighbors, the police came to arrest her because they discovered that she was organizing illegal abortions. Mike Leigh then went on to make a series of rather interesting everyday life comedies. One called Another Year, which it's very no sex, no violence, nothing really upsetting, but quite interesting psychological portraits of rather unusual people. He's a happy-go-lucky, is about a primary school teacher in London. It's great if you like London because you see lots of things, and how she is just tremendously positive and lives her life with gay abandon and thinking the best of everybody, and you get the feeling that it shouldn't work, but it does. I don't mean as a film. I mean, she should discover the terrible things about life, but she doesn't, and it works because she believes that people are positive, and they end up being positive in some way. So let's have a look at a couple of the younger directors. We have here Danny Boyle, who was born in 1956. So that's he's not that young. Okay, he's old, but it's like he's only a little older than me, so that's not that old, or is it? And now Danny Boyle is an interesting character because after he'd become well known making films, he was asked to direct and write the Olympic opening ceremony for the Olympic Games in London in 2012, which I recommend you find on YouTube. That is to say, a spectacle of dance and music and acting with very little dialogue to present Britain to the world. And when I say to the world, I really mean to the world. I think it was 600 million people watched it on television. It's absolutely incredible. And of course, because most of them are watching in another language, it has to have very little dialogue. And it was an enormous picture of things that the British feel good about, from cricket to the National Health Service to popular music. And so very much a sort of popular view of it. They certainly were not showing themselves to be proud of the British Empire and British nuclear weapons and so on. So it was taken as a rather left-wing view of what Britain should be proud of, and also very multicultural. It was, for example, there were a whole series of featured singers, including rappers and so on, people like Dizzy Rascal. So that's something he did in 2012. But before that, he first of all became well known in the 90s for Shallow Grave, which is a rather strange murder story, and Trainspotting. Now, Trainspotting was, it's a little difficult to describe if you haven't seen it. It's about heroin addicts in Edinburgh, and so some of it's quite fantastic because they're on drugs. And rather than showing heroin addicts as bored, depressed, sad people who have nothing to live for, it shows them as rather wild, very funny, zany group of people, and the whole film goes extremely fast. It's a very, very, very original film. You wouldn't mix it up with anything else, and which is perhaps one of the reasons that people either love it or hate it. It's a contrast in the traditional view in films of Edinburgh. Normally, when you have a working class film about people who are at the bottom of society, so to speak, it's set in Glasgow. So it's something quite interesting about setting it in Edinburgh, which has a reputation of being a far more bourgeois a city with a nice castle and so on and so forth. So that really made many people talk and write about it when it came out, because it was an extremely surprising film. He went on to produce a series of films, really quite different one from the other. Slumdog Millionaire was the story of an Indian boy making money on a television quiz show. Again, quite surprising. You can like it or not like it, but very surprising. And 127 Hours, which was actually based on a true story, a little gruesome, about a man who was trapped on a mountain under a rock or something for 127 hours. in a place where there was no mobile phone coverage and nobody knew where he was. And this made him have to make very difficult decisions about what he was prepared to do in order to survive. So after the 1990s, in any case, there was a new appetite for British comedy films, and this led to the popular comedies Brassed Off and The Full Monty and things like that. There was also more money around in the 1990s because the National Lottery was established. There had not been a National Lottery before, and for some reason, which I'm not quite sure of, the National Lottery decided that a percentage of the money should go to encourage British cinema. And there were more and more then British cinema produced in the 1990s. And even since 2000, the new century has been relatively successful for British cinema. When I say relatively successful, it's a small country that the cinema surviving is something. Many British films found a wide international audience. I'll be looking at them in a moment. Production companies such as Working Title were often able to cooperate with American companies and make a British film which had American money, things like Bridget Jones' Diary, for example. Interestingly, Bridget Jones' Diary in 2001 made $250 million, and the follow-up made $230 million, which is pretty good for a sequel. Love Actually in 2003 made $240 million. And then there was a whole series of films, some of which we've spoken of, like Gosford Park, Pride and Prejudice, The Constant Gardener, The Last King of Scotland, and so on. What else do we have here? Yeah, so I think I'll move on a little bit here. So if we take the so in the last few years, let's see what else we have. But no, I want to go back to the directors. I want to talk to you about one or two more directors, or perhaps only one more. Gurinder Chadha. Now, she was born in 1960, which was a wonderful year to be born. And as you can see, she is a woman of Indian origin. I think her parents were Indian. I'm pretty sure they were. This is interesting because you can imagine that although she began working in the 1980s, which was much easier for a woman than 30 years before, she was absolutely the only Indian woman director in Britain. There were, a very, very small number of women directors, a very, very small number of directors who were not white, and directors who were non-white women were, well, there's just her really. There probably isn't, there's probably somebody else, but it makes it very difficult. And yet she managed to write films which were extremely successful. She began with Bargee on the Beach in 1993. This may have been not have been her very first film, but it's the first one that people thought about. Now this is the title is a play on words, because a bargee is a kind of Indian food, but a bargee, also spelt differently in English slang, is a fight. And so this is about a day out. A group of immigrant women and their children go to the seaside for the day, and what happens. So it's a bit slice of life. It's a bit social realism and so on. And she then went on in the 2000s to go for more spectacular films, and perhaps more, to some extent, more formulaic, although extremely well done. First of all, was Bend It Like Beckham, which I know a lot of you will have seen, about a young woman who is the daughter of immigrants and who loves football. But her parents think that girls are not supposed to love football. They're supposed to be able to cook and be a good wife, and there's some of this contest. Now this is interesting. So it's a social film, but also comedy at the same time. So it's social comedy. Perhaps it was the Full Monty that introduced this idea that you can mix together a social, serious film and a comedy and put them both in the same film. But a pretty good film. I think it was probably also easier to make this film because Billy Elliot had been a big success. Billy Elliot then about a boy who liked ballet, and his parents thought, his father thought that you shouldn't like ballet, and then eventually it all works out. It's the same film, really. but Bend It Like Beckham was a great success, and she followed this up in 2004 then with Bride and Prejudice, which is Pride and Prejudice, the Jane Austen story, but set in modern day India, so that it's possible to present parents who are obsessed with getting their daughters married in the way that they in the middle classes in the 19th century, the early 19th century, when Jane Austen was writing, they would be in England. And it also involves Bollywood. It involves singing and dancing, spectacular singing and dancing from Bollywood, which makes it all the more original. Here's two more recent ones. Then 2010, It's a Wonderful Afterlife. I'm afraid I haven't seen this, so I can't tell you much about it. And then Blinded by the Light. Now, Blinded by the Light is again these are another one of a series of films about young children of immigrants and how they react to the culture around them at school and so on, the English culture and the culture of their parents, which may be different in a number of ways, religion or socially, or also in the ideas of what young people should do. Now, the better of these films, and this is one of them, managed to avoid the idea of just simply presenting the English culture as a good thing and the parents as old-fashioned, boring, and to be marginalized if you really want to live your life. And so Blinded by the Light is about this young boy of Pakistani parents who comes to love the music of Bruce Springsteen, and the music becomes the center of his life. Okay. Now, in fact, Gurinder Chadha did also do a heritage film, The Last Viceroy, which was about the last viceroy of India, and it's a heritage film in the sense that you have all the costumes and the palaces of the British Raj, that is the British domination of India. So again, it's always a temptation, but you can see that she made very many different films, but they tended to be social or comedy or both or heritage. So what I was saying about, heritage, comedy and social, that's where British directors can get the money to make films. It does appear to be the case. Well, I've almost finished, but I just want to mention another few films of the last few years. So in 2015, then Shaun the Sheep. So this was the fourth or fifth in a series of stop motion movies made by Aardman Productions. I think the first one was The Wrong Trousers, and then there was the Weir Rabbit, and then there was Chicken Run. And then Shaun the Sheep, the movie, A Small Sheep, Big City, Epic Adventure. Now, these work on the particularly interesting puppets that they managed to put together with the stop motion method, with the rather dour provincial English people who are the characters, whether it's Wallace and Gromit or in this case somebody else. But they also work on very clever dialogue, very clever humorous dialogue. Now they're not they're also work as family films that, of course, you can take your children because they will like The Sheep, but they're not really films for children. The jokes come too quickly. Although you can take your children, there won't be any sex, there won't be any violence. Another couple here came out recently, Far From the Madding Crowd, then fairly classic heritage film from Far From the Madding Crowd is a novel from Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy, really well known for Tess of the D'Urbervilles and another very, 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 very fine Jude the Obscure, very fine novelist, although it has to be said that in Thomas Hardy novels, things begin bad and then get gradually worse. Don't take your depressed friends to see a Thomas Hardy film. And The Martian, which of course involved a large amount of American actors and films, but nevertheless was counted as a British movie. I can't remember the director, I'm afraid. Another couple there again, another what's the word? Another Shakespeare play, Macbeth. Of course, there have been many of those. And here a political history play, Suffragettes. And again, here what happens is that you've got this this mix of an important political event, but presented through the portrayal of very interesting characters. And what is particular about this film is that they don't just talk about bourgeois women who were suffragettes, they very much talk about working class women. Now, naturally enough, in the suffragettes, the majority were middle class women because they had the time and they had fewer responsibilities. But nevertheless, there was a very significant proportion of working class women involved. 2016, then the latest one in the series of Bridget Jones. I didn't think it was quite as good a film, and Fantastic Beasts and. Occasionally you get something new. So Dunkirk, a fairly classic war film, going back to the war films. Dunkirk, quite a well done war film in 2017. And Paddington 1 and Paddington 2, again, these are family films, but they're not really for children, and certainly adults will go to see them, which is the story of this bear who is a character from a children's storybook. The author died quite recently, I think, who comes from darkest Peru to London, England, with a blue duffel coat and a little carton saying, "Please look after this bear, thank you." And this is the story of what happens to him as a young and naive bear in London. Extremely good animation, and also very much a radical message about refugees. There's a whole theme in there about refugees and how people should be good to refugees. So this is probably partly reflected by the fact that over the last 10 years there has been perhaps more of a radical atmosphere in Britain. So that's about all I had to say there, and I just had a last couple of slides just to mention how popular film studies degrees are these days. So there you have a degree in film and television studies, and there you can do a PhD in film studies. Yes, PhD in film studies then. At I can't see which university. So it's being taken seriously in the university these days. And that's the end of my slides. And so that's where I'm going to finish on cinema. So to sum up, then, cinema is in some ways popular culture because the audience is not expected to have specialist knowledge. It talks to a mass of ordinary people. It involves quite considerable amounts of subaltern content. We're often seeing films about not about the elite, but about the poorer people. On the other hand, it has aspects which are not so popular without being specifically high art. The most important one being that you need a huge amount of money to make a film. It also attempts to imitate high culture in another few ways, because if you see the British Film Awards, just like the Oscars, you can see everybody dresses up extremely bourgeois in order to receive a prize about their film about poor people in London. So there's this rather bizarre contradiction going on where the film directors are sometimes making films about very poor people and very radical films, and then they have to turn up with a bow tie and a perfect suit and champagne, which in Britain is a very bourgeois thing, and to get their awards. So there are contradictions going on there. Okay, this may well be the only video this week, because I went over time, and also I have rather more to talk to you in class about, but there will be more, and our next subject will be popular music. In fact, popular music will take us up to the Christmas break and the end of the semester. So thank you for listening, and that's all for now. That's all for now. If I can find the right buttons. Arrêter de partager. 5. Mettre fin à la réunion.